Well, good evening everyone, and welcome to tonight's session of the Seminary of the Third Age, and the third in our series on searching for an authentic spirituality of creation. My name is David McCurdy and I'm the current chairperson of the PCNet task group here in South Australia. And a special welcome to those of you who are with us for the first time. I'd like to begin by reminding you that the Effective Living Centre where we meet tonight is located on the lands of the Gaia people, the original occupants and traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains. The Gaia people living today maintain a strong spiritual connection with their country. We acknowledged their ancestors' careful stewardship of this part of the world for 45,000 years prior to the arrival of Europeans. And in doing so, we recognise and respect the importance of their cultural heritage and beliefs. Next, some housekeeping matters. First of all, could you please make sure that you've muted your mobile phone? If you need them, the toilets are located on each side of the foyer. And tonight we will proceed as follows. Our speaker will have the floor for 45 minutes or so, during which he will pause on at least 2 occasions to invite people to make comments or ask a question. At the end of his talk, there will be an additional opportunity for you to turn and share with your neighbour for 3 or 4 minutes on anything that particularly struck your attention as being helpful and significant or new. And that will be a final opportunity to make comments and ask questions. We will then adjourn for tea and coffee and conversation. Usually that would be out there in the next room, but because of the COVID regulations tonight, you're invited to go to the servery, get your tea, coffee, or biscuit, and come back in here and sit down. Okay, and then you can continue your conversation. So it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, the Reverend Dr. Brian Phillips. For those of you who do not know him, Brian is an alumnus of Lincoln College, North Adelaide, where he lived while studying science at the University of Adelaide. On graduating in 1961, he taught science and maths at 2 local secondary schools, before returning to Lincoln College as acting Vice Master, and then becoming a student again to study theology on this side here in Wavell at what was then the Park and Wesley College. He was ordained in 1971 and appointed to the newly formed Union Church in the city, comprising the former Perry Street Methodist and Stowe Congregational churches. His next appointment took him to the Australian National University in Canberra, where he served as Ecumenical Chaplain from 1976 to 1980. Then, bitten by the travel bug, the Phillips family took off to the UK, where for the next 3 years, Brian ministered to the Methodist Church in Staveley, Derbyshire. It was here that he embarked on a research project with the Sheffield Urban Theology Unit that would ultimately lead to a thesis entitled "Tell Me the Story," which resulted in the award of a degree of Doctor of Ministry at the New York Theological Seminary in 1985. The project on which his thesis was based involved working with lay people in a local coal mining district, first by inviting them to tell their own stories about who they were and where they fitted into the community, and second, by enabling them to tell biblical stories and to discover where those 2 streams overlapped or cohered. In Brian's own words, it was an exercise in in getting people to do their own theology, grounded in the experiences of their own lives. Now, I really like that idea. After all, isn't that what progressive Christianity is all about? Upon returning to South Australia in 1984, Brian resumed his Uniting Church ministry at Croydon Kilkenny Parish before heading back to the UK in 1989 for a 5-year term at the Streatham United Reformed Church in London. His final ministerial appointment came in 1996 when he was called to Morn Uniting Church back in Adelaide, from which he retired in 2002 to live in Bethany in the Barossa Valley. But that was not the end of his active involvement with the Uniting Church. In 2008, as a member of the board of Uniting Communities, Brian was the first to present a paper arguing for carbon neutrality. 2 years later, the board made the decision to become carbon neutral across the whole organisation, which it achieved by its target date of 2015. Since then, other initiatives have further reduced the Uniting Church's greenhouse gas emissions. A new target of zero emissions was announced last week. Brian was closely engaged in this whole process until he retired from the board. He remains engaged with the committee that continues to drive reductions and set targets. And not surprisingly, because of his track record, he was invited in 2014 to become a foundation member of the Uniting Church's Synod's Environmental Action Group. It was Brian's early background in the teaching of science that in the late 1980s prompted him to take an interest in the impacts on the Earth's climate of the steadily increasing emissions into the atmosphere of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. He was awarded an MSc in Climate Change and Sustainable Development by the De Montfort University in the UK and has recently completed online courses in climate change from other universities in Illinois, Vancouver, San Diego and Melbourne. So, I can think of no one who's better qualified to speak to us now on the topic, why climate change is everything, the Anthropocene and our relationship with the Earth. Please welcome Brian to the...
Thank you. Thank you, David, for that over-generous welcome and introduction. Thank you too to Seminary of the Third Age for inviting me. I understand this is what happens if you call in on Lord Harbour on Saturday afternoon and have a glass of wine with him.
That's right.
Or come again, or I won't. So thank you very much for having me here tonight. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you too, David, for the editorial work that you were able to do on the slides that we're seeing tonight. So in this presentation, I hope to achieve 4 things. Didn't change, okay.
So just saying, Bruce, could you just go to the next slide then? Just so Bruce can just change the slide.
That's good. Let's see. I've got it. Okay. In this presentation, I hope to achieve 4 things. First, to explain why geologists are considering designating a new geological epoch to be called the Anthropocene. To explain what Earth science is and how it has identified a rupture in Earth system and to spell out what this means for how we relate to Earth. And finally, how this might bring about changes to how we talk about God. In points 1 and 2, what I'm trying to do is build a framework in order to support the real issues that are to be addressed in points 3 and 4. So please bear with me as I go through the essential evidence and thinking upon which the last 2 points rest. On the way, as David has explained, there will be a couple of breaks to give you a break from me talking. But first of all, let's unpack some terminology. We're in the midst of a transition from one geological epoch to another. The benign and stable Earth climate system that settled in at the end of the last glacial period about 10 to 11,000 years ago is labelled by geostratigraphers as the Holocene, which literally means recent. The Holocene covers a period of geological and climatic conditions that made possible the development of agriculture, the development of villages and cities, and the building of the first civilizations right up until the present day. The International Commission on Stratigraphy is a subgroup of the International Union of Geological Sciences and concerns itself with geological and geochronological matters on a global scale. It defines the names, the periods, the epochs and ages of the International Geological Timescale. The ICS is expected to meet later this year and receive a report from its Anthropocene Working Group, which is an interdisciplinary group made up of Earth system scientists, historians, philosophers and geologists. And it's expected that the ICS will declare the end of the Holocene epoch and announce a new epoch, the Anthropocene. The boundary between the two epochs is expected to be set in the mid-20th century, which coincides with nuclear weapon testing that has left geological markers across the globe in the form of radioactive isotopes. More significantly, it coincides with what is termed the Great Acceleration, a period that saw a rapid growth in wealth and consumption in the industrialised nations, an increase in industrial production and mobility, all largely fueled by the burning of coal and oil and gas. It was in the 1950s the Earth system began to be noticeably impacted by changes directly caused by the rapid increase in greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions had been going on since the beginning of the industrial age, and of course, but it was not until the mid-20th century that there were noticeable impacts on the Earth system. Let me just explain the diagram. If you think of Earth, planet Earth, as being in the bowl of the Holocene, as contained by that U-shaped structure, it had a natural variability. It could go up and down between the bottom and the green line that you see through there. But with the first human agricultural pressures and industrial revolution, it's been pushed upwards towards that red line, which is the 1950s. And as you see, great acceleration has caused, that's the massive increase in burning of coal, oil and gas, has caused it to come right out of the Holocene safe environment, and it's now well into the Anthropocene. In fact, the Anthropocene is already here. And this is not just a simple matter of geological nomenclature. This new state we have now entered has profound implications for our continuing relationship with Earth. We are on a trajectory towards hothouse Earth. We have changed the direction of the geological evolution of our planet. What was once unthinkable is now the reality. I want to say something about Earth system science. It's a relatively recent field of study. One of the most influential systemic studies of the Earth and the human impact on it was published in 1972, and it was the Club of Rome's report called Limits to Growth by Meadows et al. In the foreword to that work, the authors wrote these words: "It is the predicament of humankind that we can perceive the problematic." Now Now, the problematic is being used there to talk about the complex of issues associated with the topic, specifically the totality of environmental and other problems affecting the world. It's our predicament that we can perceive the problematic, yet despite our considerable knowledge and skills, we do not understand the origins, significance, and interrelationships of its many components, and thus we're unable to devise effective responses. This failure occurs in large part because we continue to examine single items in the problematic without understanding that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. That change in one element means change in the others. This is a very clear statement of the dilemma that's facing Western science. Having made huge advances over 5 centuries on the basis of analysis, where each little piece of a larger system is analysed independently of the remainder of the system, we've built an incredible store of knowledge and understanding. But when it comes to systems like the climate system, or the deep water currents in the oceans of the world, or the workings of a living cell, analysis of one small part of the system may yield some interesting information, but it tells us next to nothing about what role that one small part plays in the whole complexity of the system, or the effect that change in one small component will have on the whole. Empirical science has traditionally broken things down into their components in order to simplify. Systems, on the other hand, are noteworthy for their complexity, with many elements interacting with each other. Changing one element of a complex system can bring unpredictable consequences for the system as a whole. Small triggers can set in train disproportionately large consequences. Now, a huge step forward in our recognition of the significance of the Earth system came with the publication of the Gaia Hypothesis at about the same time as the Limits of Growth report came out. James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis proposed that living organisms and inorganic matter together form a synergistic, self-regulating complex system. The whole Earth, they said, is a single self-regulating system comprised of many different systems, all of which interact with each other. So to summarise, systems have several characteristics in common. They are complex, which means that changing one part of the system can have unexpected impacts on other parts or on the whole. Systems may not react in a simple linear way to outside or internal stimuli. Within a system, feedback loops may operate, which means a small change in one part of the system can lead to amplified consequences for the whole. Systems display emergent behaviour. That is, the behaviour of a system does not depend on its individual parts, but on their relationships to one another. Emergent behaviour cannot be predicted by examination of a system's individual parts. It can only be predicted, managed, or controlled by understanding the parts and their relationships. So how does this play out in some of Earth's systems? Here are some examples. The thermohaline deep ocean currents are driven by temperature, that's the thermo bit, and salinity, that's the halide bit. They're driven by temperature and salinity gradients. They, along with the wind-driven surface currents, together make up the so-called global ocean conveyor belt, operating in all the world's oceans. These are massive movements of seawater. Water moves from the Arctic as dense, colder water at depth, and then the colder water as it rises brings with it essential nutrients for marine life. At lower latitudes, that is in the hot part of the globe, at lower latitudes it warms and then returns to the Arctic. One of these currents is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, or as it's usually known, the Gulf Stream. It was first noted by Portuguese sailors in the late 15th century while sailing south along the eastern coast of North America. They noticed that even though they were moving through the water, they were, relative to the land, moving backwards. Such is the magnitude of the AMOC. The AMOC carries massive quantities of heat. The equivalent heat energy of 10 Hiroshima bombs passes a given point each second. It contributes to a milder northern hemisphere, with the British Isles and Western Europe and parts of eastern North America having much damper, warmer climates than they otherwise would have because of the AMOC. If it were to slow down or stop, there would be dramatic impacts on the localised climate of those countries and much wider afield too. The Amazon rainforest would be impacted. So too would the timing and location of the tropical monsoons in West Africa and Asia. Recent research, just published in the last few days, reports that the AMOC is at its weakest for at least 1600 years. If reduced beyond a certain, currently uncertain limit, it may collapse suddenly with huge implications for our lives. Now, rather than give a detailed explanation of what's going on here, I will simply say this. Increased temperatures in the Arctic region, causing the Arctic sea ice to decrease in area and thickness, and massive ice melt from the Greenland ice cap, are weakening the driver of the AMOC. Now, there are other examples also of the rupture of global scale systems. Here's another one. Global wind patterns, in particular the Arctic jet stream, are becoming less stable and more erratic. Just make sure this... Got to make sure it goes. Yeah, it's going, okay. In the Northern Hemisphere, this has the anomalous effect of incursions of cold Arctic air further south than is usually experienced, giving rise to Arctic-style blizzards, as experienced just a few months ago in Texas. At the same time, in another place, there can be an incursion of warm air moving a lot further north than is normal. Now, if I let this little movie play on, you will see how, as the ice shrinks, the movement from east to west slows down and becomes less stable. This instability is already causing weather extremes in North America and at the mid-latitudes. The jet stream instability may be partly caused by a lowering of the temperature gradient between the low, the hot latitudes, and the high, the cold latitudes. That is, the Arctic is getting warmer, more rapidly than any part of the globe, actually. Bill McKibben recently wrote, in fact, name a large physical system on the planet, and chances are that it is now in chaotic flux. But it's not only physical systems. Biosphere systems are also changing. Plants and animals are slowly migrating polewards as temperatures rise. Germinating and flowering seasons are changing. Disease vectors are moving either to higher altitudes or polewards. Areas that were once too cool to support the disease carriers, for instance mosquitoes, have warmed and are now able to host the carriers of diseases such as dengue, fever and malaria. Earth systems are being disrupted. That is the reality of the Anthropocene. The legacy of science and the Enlightenment that followed left behind a legacy concerning the way that we regard Earth. We began to treat Earth as an impassive object. We believed we could do with nature as we willed. We could bend it to our design. We could exploit it to meet our every want. That legacy is now endangering not only our way of life, but our continuing existence as a species. Let's take a little break. Maybe if you do have a direct question, ask it. Maybe you might just want to say something to your next door neighbour. But if you have a question, put your hand up and we'll bring the microphone to you.
Over here.
Or talk to each other. Or go out and make a cup of tea.
Carrots.
Okay, shall I go on? The advent of the Anthropocene requires a change in the narrative. Earth will no longer be subdued, or be brought under control, or be pacified. We may no longer regard nature as a commodity. We can try to use the leverage of our knowledge and technical skills to pull the Earth into our orbit, but it is pulling back. We may no longer regard Earth as a physical object that leaves Earth open to our manipulation and our exploitation. Our relationship with Earth has shifted. Earth's relationship towards us has shifted. And our narrative is going to change accordingly. Clive Hamilton writes, "The very cultivation of our powers has left us exposed to a nature that refuses to be tamed and is increasingly unsympathetic to our interests." Hamilton goes on to say, "Humans now rival the great forces of nature." Climate scientist Wally Broker warned, "The climate system is an angry beast and we are poking it with sticks." The idea that we can depend on the constancy of Mother Earth to nature and to nurture and provide for her children is now dangerously misleading. Hamilton's even more emphatic. When Mother Earth opens her arms, it is not to embrace us, but to crush us. The future of the planet and the future of many forms of life, including our own species, depend on the degree to which we can collectively and cooperatively pull back from our profligate exploitation of Earth's resources. The idea that nature is there to be controlled and bent to fulfill our purposes is not only anachronistic, it is seriously wrong. So too the ideology that God has given us dominion over Earth and all its creatures. It is folly to think we can control what happens once we, by our conscious actions, unsettle any of Earth's complex systems. Some disruptions, once they begin, are irreversible. The impacts will last for millennia. For example, the melting of the Greenland or West Antarctic ice caps, or the dieback of the Amazon rainforest as it transforms to grassland, or the melting of the Siberian permafrost with consequent release of methane. Once these systems reach a tipping point, then the change becomes irreversible. That's the way systems behave. The so-called tipping points at which these irreversible changes move beyond our control remain uncertain due to the complexity of the systems and the way in which natural feedback mechanisms operate. In these cases, uncertainty is not our friend. In these matters, there remains a well-entrenched cultural ideology that we'd better come to terms with sooner or later. It might be called human exceptionalism, or perhaps human entitlement. That we are distinct and a little removed from the natural world, above it, not of it, entitled to use and manipulate nature for our own ends. The natural world is valued for what use it has for us, rather than having value in its own right. A respect for country, for its connections to the ancestors, for the land formation, for the plants and the animals is something we could learn from our First Nation people, if only we knew how to listen and to learn. There is a very clear difference in the way they see their relationship with the natural world and how we see it. For us, Earth has been an object that we, as subjects, may use or abuse without fear of retaliation. Here is the kernel of the matter, the way I see it. Whenever we relate to another being or thing as an object, its value is always relative. It no longer has value in its own right. Its value resides in its utility to us. This can apply as much to another human being as it does to an inanimate object or a living plant or an animal. The earth as object means we can use the leverage of our knowledge and our technical skills to try to bend it to our will. If Earth retaliates, then we simply counter with a new technique. But the autonomy of nature, despite our best efforts, remains ineradicable. By trying to dominate nature through geoengineering, for instance, we might provoke blowback that is unhealthy for humanity. Because tinkering with one part of Earth's system is bound to have unexpected and probably very unwelcome side effects. The need to adapt to or cooperate with nature rather than control nature is what drives some people mad about renewables, because renewables require humility. This is Melanie Klein's insight. No, sorry, not Melanie Klein, she's a psychologist. I mean, Naomi Klein's insight. Renewables require humility. Those of us who continue in our belief that we can own and control the earth find it hard to stomach that the power of the sun and the wind and the waves can be harnessed, but never fully possessed. The widespread adoption, for instance, of renewable energy requires a fundamental shift in power relations between humanity and the natural world. A sensibility of human folly and vulnerability would be a helpful start, writes Clive Hamilton. If we don't ditch our colonising, take possession of everything mentality, we will find ourselves in a long war of attrition against nature, a war that we will never win. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said, "The biggest risk is that we miss this opportunity in 2021 to reverse the suicidal trend in which we are waging war with nature." From the so-called Dark Ages following the collapse of the Roman Empire, and although the Dark Ages were far from dark, especially in the Islamic world, from the collapse of the Roman Empire and what we call the Dark Ages, the West moved into the light with the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. Reason triumphed over superstition. The modern period dawned. The enchanted earth where the spirits were ever present in nature and were acknowledged in everyday life gave way to a clear distinction between subject, us, and object, nature. No longer did miners placate the spirits before digging into the earth. The spirits had absconded and left passive earth to our mercy and whatever we chose to do to it. the Earth itself became an object for scientific study and potential exploitation. This distinction between subject and object was one of the intellectual triumphs of the Enlightenment. And then what came next was the Industrial Revolution, based on steam-driven machinery and coal-fired furnaces. The blight of industrialisation that was grieved by the poets and artists of the Romantic period spread rapidly around the globe. An object is understood as being impassive. It is not subject to suffering. It can be used and disposed of at will. We have no responsibility to it. We are not responsible for its welfare. If, for instance, we were to regard rocks and rivers, oceans and sea creatures, trees and grasses as persons, as subjects, what would follow? Subjects can be negotiated with. They have inherent rights. They can be wronged against. They can be loved and respected. There isn't anything new about that. It comes very close to what First Peoples all over the world have lived and continue to live by. And then in the Western tradition, we have St. Francis of Assisi, who in his Canticle of the Sun pointed us in this direction hundreds of years ago. Sun, moon, earth, water, fire, death, they are our brothers and our sisters. They cannot be for us mere utilitarian objects. They are family. Just as in a human family, we do not have unconstrained freedom to do as we like, so too we do not float free in the natural world. We are constrained within it. We do not exist outside of nature. We are part of nature, a part of the family. In New Zealand in 2017, by an Act of Parliament, the Wanganui River was granted personhood and is now recognised as an indivisible and living being. One of the Maori activists who fought for this recognition said, "For the first time, a legal framework stems from the intrinsic spiritual values of an indigenous belief system." Could it be that this becomes an historical marker, the point at which the modern era gives way to its successor, where the rights of all aspects of the natural world are acknowledged? Respecting rivers as a legally recognised living entity may begin to change the conversation. And that conversation is now happening in several different places. Entering this new epoch of the Anthropocene, we are faced with this stark reality. We have the power to change the direction of Earth's geological evolution. By our conscious actions, we are disrupting Earth's systems. If we are not to misuse that power, then we need to confess that we have used it ignorantly and recklessly. The consequences are now beginning to rebound on us as we struggle to learn how to live in and relate to an Earth that is responding with growing intensity to our collective hubris. Earth will continue to push back. Weather will become more chaotic. Destruction from fire, storm, flood, drought and extreme heat will affect us more frequently. Species of plants and animals will continue to be driven to extinction. The complex marine food chain will be disrupted by acidification of the oceans. Coastal cities and important river estuary food bowls will be inundated by rising seas. This is the legacy we moderns have created for ourselves and our children's children. We have responsibility for how all this will play out. The gods no longer hear us. We dismissed them 200 years ago. Utopian myths, whether religious or secular, are a distraction from what must be done now. The declaration of this new geological epoch changes everything. Not the declaration itself, of course, but the upheaval already underway of our accustomed mode of thinking and acting with respect to the natural world. Nature has come back from the sidelines into the game and is playing hardball. The Earth system is no longer a passive recipient of our manipulation, an infinite resource for our extraction, an inexhaustible receptacle for our waste. Earth is now reacting to our abuse. It is turning a new face towards us. Systems that were once predictable and reliable are becoming unpredictable as triggers are switched from one state to another. Earth is a key actor in our fate. As Naomi Klein observed, our planet has a way of inserting itself into our calculations, rapidly changing the views of those who imagine themselves to be safe. The face we now turn to the natural world will determine our fate. We listen and learn in order to cooperate with Mother Earth, or we suffer. Species are extinguished and agriculture becomes precarious. The way we relate to Earth is in the process of an evolutionary step change. I suggest in the title that climate changes everything, and I have in mind an everything that also includes how we talk about God. But before I approach that topic, let's take a break. Maybe you want to react to what you've heard from me over these last few minutes. Talk amongst yourselves, ask a question. Does all of this make sense to you? Okay, let's get on. Let's move on. The Christian religion, in particular in Western mainstream culture, has become a religion of propositions rather than of experience. Indeed, our religious practices, from my observation, continue to develop and reinforce our skill at being able to distance ourselves from the real. We prefer to see things indirectly via a mirror, as it were, rather than address the real thing face to face. We abstract ourselves from the real. It's become easy for us, therefore, to carry on not seeing the obvious signs of Earth's systems being disrupted. Now, I'm not suggesting that ignoring Earth's plight and practicing a religion that is largely propositional are causally linked, but I seriously wonder if they're not reinforcing each other. Get real could well be the challenge with which we confront both our out-of-touch religion and our out-of-touchness with the natural world. The call for change relating to climate issues is constantly before us, but not so clearly articulated is the imperative to effect a radical shift in our religious sensibility. Both are urgently needed. So what follows now are some directions I believe we need to consider if we are to recover a balanced faith and a humble recognition that we may no longer dispose ourselves as rulers of the universe. The starting point for this, for me, is to accept the reality that God is not something out there above and beyond the materiality of this universe. The reality to which we give the name God is embedded intimately within the creation. God becomes known to us from within the material universe and not from beyond it. And we do not know God through believing some propositions about God. Some years ago, I read C.G. Jung's controversial book, Answer to Job. I remember how startled I was as the realisation began to dawn on me that God is not an object to be observed, commented on, described. Our apperception of God is always subjective. God cannot be known as an object to be studied, analysed, or described. God can only be known from within the subject-to-subject relationship. C.G. Jung was famously asked in an interview whether he now believed in God, and he replied, "I don't need to believe." And by that I understand, I don't need to believe in certain propositions about God, that certain propositions about God are true. I don't need to believe, I know. Meister Eckhart, the 13th, 14th century Dominican teacher, intellectual and mystic, wrote, "God is no thing. God is nothing. No thing. That is, God is not an object, only subject. God can only be known intuitively by the soul." When Eckhart said, "I pray to God to rid me of God," I understand him to be saying, "I pray to God to rid me of all ideas or propositions about God." Framing our relationship with God this way has some radical consequences. Firstly, our relationship with the divine is a subjective reality, one that is essentially interior and experienced at a deep psychological level. Belief in the historical artefacts of religion, scriptures, doctrines, and theological ideas are secondary or derivative of direct experience, heart-to-heart communion. Knowing the mind of God, as some scientists in the 20th century described their explorations, does not in itself bring about a knowing of God. We so easily mistake an image of God, what we might discover about the mind of God, for the real. And the real is not the mind of God, but our heart-to-heart experience of the real. 20th century Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner said it this way: "In the days ahead, you will either be a mystic, one who has experienced God for real, or nothing at all." I'm not suggesting that an experience of this subject-to-subject encounter cannot be talked about, nor do I want to imply that the experience itself might not have an objectively observable outcome. But when we do talk about the experience of God, we need to have the humility to recognise that we are saying no more than this: "This is my God image at this time." God is first and foremost a mystery who can never be fully captured by one image. Secondly, our experience of the divine will be mediated by earthy things, the day-to-day encounters with other people, the buzzing confusion of the world around us, the wonder of the universe within which our planet is but a speck. The challenge for us is to become more attuned, not just to what is going on around us, but to how our soul responds to this. Vincent van Gogh once wrote, "When I have a terrible need of, dare I say the word, religion, then I go out and paint the stars." Who has not looked at a clear sky on a moonless night and wondered at the mystery and wonder of it all? or who has not examined closely, and dare I say it lovingly, the rocks that tell a story about events that happened millions of years ago and reflected on the primordial creation events? Or who has not watched with fascination the ocean waves smashing against a rocky coastline and experienced wonder? Wonder, awe, fascination. How did all this come to be? Why life? Why me? Ibrahim Abdul-Matin describes a basic tenet of Islam. The earth is a mosque, or for that we could say a temple or a shrine or a cathedral. The earth is a mosque, and everything in it is sacred. A retreatant in a Muslim-led retreat, after walking in silence through the countryside and listening to the creaking of the trees in the wind, the bird song, the sound of her own breathing, she said, "Only in the silence could we hear their praise." Thomas Berry, 20th century cultural historian and scholar of the world's religions, wrote, "Only now have we begun to listen with some attention and with a willingness to respond to the earth's demands, that we cease our industrial assault, that we abandon our inner rage against the conditions of our earthly existence, that we renew our human participation in the grand liturgy of the universe." To be caught up in the grand liturgy of the universe engenders a reflective and loving approach to all that surrounds us. And thirdly, and finally, this view leads to a radical ecumenism. The experience of the divine is universal and certainly does not depend on a particular religious stance. It doesn't even require a person to be religious. The particular way in which an encounter with the real gets expressed will always be formed within a surrounding cultural milieu of stories, teachings, doctrines and laws. And so here in Australia, if we begin to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts and our minds to the landscape of this ancient land, we might be surprised as the stories of the Dreamtime ancestors, communicated through the ceremonies and the art of our First Nation people, begin to speak to our hearts. The conceit that Christians alone know God, that we alone have access to communion with the divine, will be overtaken by a more generous, humble and less defensive understanding of the reality of the experience of the divine. God communicates with Earth's creatures as God wills. Heart-to-heart communion between us and the divine is not confined to one religious tradition, but is open to all, believers and non-believers alike, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, traditional, indigenous, all without exception. We will learn from each other, and we will learn from Mother Earth herself.
Thank you, Brian. I was blown away by that. I just wonder how we can incorporate what you have opened up to us tonight. Well, for starters, in our Sunday worship. Thank you, my friend. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Are there any questions that you would like to ask while we're all gathered together?
Thank you. Slide number 20, you said we have the capacity, I think, to do something about this. I wondered who the we were, And do we really have the ability to make a change? I talked to Max next door to me. He said, well, he thought we had the willingness. But the willingness may be there for a few, but isn't there for everybody. And it's the willingness that is important, I think.
One of the maybe surprising things about the 6th AR report from the IPCC is that while the science is saying how desperate the situation is and how dire it all is, enough for the UN Secretary General to say this is a red alert for the human race. The surprising thing is that those very people who, and I know, weep sometimes when they are working with the kind of situations that we can imagine that are going on within the structures of the Earth system. They can still say, yet we still have time to change this. There is still time to stop the very worst effects. That diagram that you saw right back at the beginning is from a paper by Stefan from the ANU et al. That's part of a paper where they talk together about the way Earth is heading for a hothouse Earth. I used that term when I was talking about it. But they are quite strong in saying, but we can prevent the worst of this. You know, that's capacity. The question you ask about whether we're motivated, I can't answer that question.
Thank you for a very provocative and honest talk. A lot of emphasis is placed on environmental issues such as mining, but little attention is often paid to the effects of animal agriculture. For example, I think at least half of the habitable land on this planet is used by animal agro-businesses. And I think the IPCC's report recognised the dramatic role that methane from cattle is causing havoc to the global warming system. And of course we have rampant deforestation and land clearing for sheep, and then of course the recent phenomenon in the last 100 years of zoonotic diseases such as Spanish flu, swine flu, Ebola and COVID. If the future of our planet, if for example energy sources are to become renewable, should our food source be plant-based then, if you think we are to take seriously the issue that's facing our planet?
Methane is contributing about 1/3 of the impact of greenhouse gases. Fortunately, methane doesn't last long in the atmosphere, but when it does get into the atmosphere, it's about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So methane is a very significant contributor to the greenhouse gases and to the rising temperatures. And yes, sheep and cattle do burp and fart. And it's methane. Methane, that's not the only source of methane. Leaking gas wells and leaks from gas pipelines is a major contributor to the methane in the atmosphere. But we're going to have to change our diets. I don't think there's any question about that. We're going to have to reduce the amount of meat that we eat. And as you probably know, because of the voracious appetite for meat, the Amazon is being cleared for soybeans in order to feed cattle. You know, it's just beyond words to think of the is it ignorance or is it just blatant disregard for what's going on? So yes, our diet's going to have to change. And the question of zoonotic diseases, like the one that we're all masked up against now, that's what happens when systems start to crumble. And the separation of animals from human beings is that separation is degenerated by the way in which our human populations are pushing out into the areas where these animals are. So I don't know, is it a question, or is it just a chance for me to say, yeah, agree with you? Because, yes, we're going to have to change our diets.
I was interested in the question about the food, because I was thinking internally too, we're polluting our bodies and doing obscene surgeries to them and those things that you see on YouTube. But how close are we getting to original sin in this? Is it that we've replaced magic in the 19th century with a belief in development, and that's our eternal burden, is that we think we can control nature?
Well, it's not eternal because it's only about 300 years old in terms of human history that we can control nature. Francis Bacon was the initiator of this idea, and of course that's carried on through the scientific revolution. I would suggest that it's human hubris, inflated concept of who we are, that might be at the root of this. And if you want to call that the original sin, then maybe that's the way to go. I mean, I'd avoid that language myself, but I do think that, and I suppose that's why I was talking about human exceptionalism, the idea that we're not part of nature, that we can somehow or other separate ourselves. That's hubris. That's an unreal attitude towards our own power and our own ability to control things. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but
I took a second part to that.
And my second part was that it corresponds to reduction in slavery. So we've always seemed to have had this attitude that one person must dominate another, and to turn that other into an object. When you were speaking about that reminded me so much. And we know now that slavery goes right back to Roman times and before that. And that's why I was thinking of the term original sin, that there's this fundamental need, terrible need in our bodies to objectify living systems.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that analysis. I mean, slaves were objects, weren't they, for sale in the marketplace, for doing with as you wished. That's the thing about objects. You have no responsibility towards them. So, yes, the answer is.
I think we'll close the formal questioning session. Please join me again in thanking Brian for his presentation. Before we head out and grab our cup of coffee and come back in here, I'm just inviting Norm Harwell to say briefly what our next Thursday's session is going to be about.
Next Thursday, we will be launching my new book. It was called Wisdom Trinity, and it's about the spiritual in creation. It really links up with what we've been talking about today. There'll be a brief launch for about 10 minutes at the beginning by Bob Kempe, who's an old friend of mine. And then we will launch into wisdom and the spiritual dimension of wisdom in creation and begin to recognize and relate to creation and elements of creation as subject. You're invited to come to be part of that launch and the three dimensions of wisdom, and I'll explore those with you and ask you to respond, and we might end with a song or two, but we'd be delighted if you would come, and you're happy to invite other people to be part of the launch and part of the analysis that follows. Please come.
Thanks, Norm. Tea and coffee is now on offer.